Confucius was born in 551 BCE in the state of Lu, in what is now modern-day Shandong province in China. His given name was Kong Chu, and he later became known as Confucius, or Master Calm, which was Latinized as Confucius. He was born into a family that had once been noble, but had fallen into relative poverty. His father, a military officer, died when Confucius was very young, leaving his mother to raise him under modest circumstances. From early childhood, Confucius experienced both the traditions of aristocratic culture and the insecurity of declining status, an experience that shaped his lifelong concern with social order, moral conduct, and proper relationships. Confucius lived during the late Zhou dynasty, a period marked by political fragmentation, corruption, and constant warfare between rival states. The old feudal order was breaking down, and rulers increasingly governed through force rather than moral authority. Rituals that once structured society had become empty formalities, and officials often pursued personal gain rather than public responsibility. Confucius grew up observing this disorder and developed a deep conviction that society's collapse was rooted not in laws or military weakness, but in moral failure. He believed that harmony could only be restored through ethical reform, education, and the cultivation of virtuous leaders. Despite his modest background, Confucius was deeply committed to learning. He studied history, poetry, ritual, music, and moral philosophy, drawing heavily from ancient texts that preserved the values of earlier, more stable eras. He believed that the wisdom of the past contained essential lessons for the present. Unlike many thinkers of his time, Confucius did not focus on metaphysical speculation or divine revelation. Instead, he concentrated on human behavior, social roles, and ethical self-cultivation. For him, the foundation of a good society lay in the character of individuals, especially those in positions of authority. As an adult, Confucius worked in minor administrative roles in the state of Lu. For a brief period, he held positions that allowed him to implement limited reforms. He emphasized merit over birth, discipline over indulgence, and moral example over coercion. Confucius believed that a ruler who governed with virtue would inspire loyalty and obedience without resorting to violence. However, his ideas challenged entrenched interests and threatened powerful families who benefited from corruption and disorder. As a result, his reforms were resisted, undermined, and eventually abandoned. Disappointed but not defeated, Confucius chose a different path. Rather than withdrawing into silence, he became a teacher, traveling from state to state with a small group of students. He offered instruction to anyone willing to learn, regardless of social rank, an unusual practice in a rigidly hierarchical society. Confucius taught that education was the means by which moral character could be cultivated and social harmony restored. His teaching focused on concepts such as ren, often translated as humaneness or benevolence, and li, the proper conduct governing relationships and rituals. These principles were practical, emphasizing respect, responsibility, and self-restraint in everyday life. Despite his dedication, Confucius struggled to find rulers willing to listen. Many leaders dismissed him as outdated, impractical, or overly idealistic. They sought quick solutions, military strength, or legal control, not moral reform. Confucius was often treated as an inconvenience rather than a visionary. He spent years wandering, advising, teaching, and observing the repeated failure of those in power to recognize the importance of ethical leadership. This period of rejection deeply affected him, reinforcing his belief that true reform was difficult and often unwelcome. Confucius's students remained loyal, recording his sayings, observing his conduct, and preserving his teachings. These teachings were later compiled into the Analects, a collection of brief statements and conversations that reflect his moral philosophy. In these texts, Confucius emphasized self-discipline, respect for tradition, filial piety, and the importance of fulfilling one's role within society. He taught that social harmony arises when individuals act with integrity and when rulers lead by moral example rather than force. In his later years, Confucius returned to Lu, where he devoted himself to teaching and editing classical texts. Though he was respected as a teacher, he never achieved the political influence he sought. He remained frustrated by the inability of rulers to embrace ethical reform. Confucius died in 479 BCE, believing that his mission had largely failed. He had not restored order. had not persuaded kings to rule by virtue, and had not seen his vision realized. By the standards of political success, his life appeared disappointing. Yet Confucius's influence did not end with his death. Over time, his teachings spread, preserved by generations of students and scholars. During later dynasties, Confucianism became the foundation of Chinese education, governance, and social values. His emphasis on moral cultivation, respect for hierarchy tempered by responsibility, and the power of ethical leadership shaped Chinese civilization for over 2,000 years. Ideas that were ignored or rejected during his lifetime became central to imperial governance and cultural identity. Confucius was often misunderstood while he lived. Many saw him as conservative, rigid, or impractical, failing to recognize that his reforms were radical in their demand for moral accountability. He did not call for revolution or violence, but for inner transformation, a slower and more demanding path. His life illustrates the difficulty of ethical reform in times of instability and the resistance faced by those who challenge corruption through moral means rather than force. Today, Confucius is remembered not as a successful politician, but as a moral teacher whose influence far exceeded his immediate circumstances. His life demonstrates that ideas can outlive failure, that rejection does not negate truth, and that reform often begins in thought before it appears in action. Confucius's legacy stands as a reminder that meaningful change is often misunderstood in its own time, and that moral vision may only be recognized long after the reformer is gone.